The sound of crushing metal echoed across my pasture like thunder. I watched in stunned silence as 2,000 pounds of pure fury reduced a $70,000 Tesla Model S into expensive scrap metal. Steam rose from the crumpled hood. Broken glass scattered across the dirt like diamonds in the dust. Karen Wellington stood frozen beside the wreckage of her pride and joy. Her perfectly manicured hands trembled as she stared at what used to be her gleaming status symbol. The animal control officers were already backing away, their clipboards forgotten as they witnessed nature's own brand of justice. My grandfather's prize bull, Thunder, snorted once and returned to grazing as if nothing had happened. But everything had changed. 3 months of harassment, threats, and legal warfare had led to this moment. The HOA president who thought she could bulldoze her way through anyone finally met her match. This is how a 2,000-pound bull taught a corporate lawyer the true meaning of property rights. My grandfather always said the land would outlast us all. Standing on the front porch of his old farmhouse, I finally understood what he meant. 5 acres of rolling pasture stretched before me, dotted with heritage cattle and framed by the ancient oak trees that had watched over this property for generations. I inherited this piece of heaven when Grandpa passed 6 months ago. The lawyers called it a unique situation because the ranch sat smack in the middle of what was now Willowbrook Estates, a brand new subdivision filled with cookie-cutter McMansions and manicured lawns. While developers had bought up every farm around us, Grandpa had refused to sell. Now the property was mine, along with all the memories of summer afternoons spent learning to ride horses and helping with the cattle. The farmhouse needed work, but the bones were solid. Original hardwood floors creaked under my feet as I walked through rooms filled with decades of family history. The kitchen still smelled like Grandma's apple pie, and the stone fireplace bore the scorch marks from countless winter evenings. I could picture it perfectly. Modern amenities blended with rustic charm, honoring the past while embracing the future. My architect, David, arrived that Tuesday morning with rolled blueprints and infectious enthusiasm. We spread the plans across the dining room table, and I felt my excitement building as he explained each detail. We would preserve the original structure while adding a modern kitchen extension. The barn would be restored to its former glory, and the pasture would remain untouched. "This is going to be incredible," David said, his eyes lighting up as he pointed to the elevation drawings. "We are talking about architectural heritage here. Properties like this are disappearing all across the country." "That is exactly why I want to do this right," I replied, running my fingers over the blueprints. "My grandfather built something special here. I want to honor that." We spent the morning measuring rooms and discussing timelines. The project would take 8 months, but the result would be worth every penny. A perfect blend of modern comfort and agricultural authenticity, set on land that had been in my family for 40 years. That afternoon, I was reviewing contractor bids when I heard the mail truck rumble up the gravel driveway. Among the usual bills and advertisements was an official-looking envelope marked Willowbrook Estates Homeowners Association Violation Notice. My hands trembled as I tore open the envelope. The letter was typed on crisp letterhead and signed by someone named Karen Wellington, HOA president. I read it twice before the words sank in. "Dear property owner," it began, "it has come to our attention that your property at 1247 Old Farm Road is in violation of multiple Willowbrook Estates covenants and restrictions. Specifically, you are engaging in agricultural activities inconsistent with residential zoning, maintaining livestock on residential property, and allowing structures that detract from neighborhood aesthetic standards." The letter went on to demand immediate removal of all livestock, cessation of agricultural activities, and compliance with architectural guidelines for any future improvements. It threatened daily fines of $50 and potential legal action if violations were not corrected within 30 days. I stared at the letter in disbelief. Agricultural activities. This had been a working ranch for decades before the first McMansion was even planned. The property had grandfathered rights that predated any HOA by years. How could they possibly claim jurisdiction over land that existed long before their precious subdivision? I called my lawyer immediately. Sarah Martinez had handled Grandpa's estate and knew the property's history better than anyone. "Do not worry about this," she said after I read her the letter. "Your property has established agricultural rights that no HOA can touch. This is just intimidation tactics." But as I hung up the phone and looked out at Thunder grazing peacefully in the pasture, I could not shake the feeling that this was just the beginning. The tone of that letter felt like a declaration of war, and I had the sinking suspicion that Corinne Wellington was not the type of person who backed down easily. The dream of honoring my grandfather's legacy suddenly felt more complicated than I had imagined. Corinne Wellington arrived at my property 3 days later like a general inspecting a battlefield. I watched from the kitchen window as her pristine white Tesla Model S glided up my gravel driveway, looking completely out of place among the rural setting. The car was spotless, every surface gleaming like she had just driven it off the showroom floor. She emerged from the vehicle wearing a crisp business suit and designer heels, completely inappropriate for walking on ranch property. Her blonde hair was pulled back in a severe bun, and she carried a leather portfolio like a weapon. Even from a distance, I could see the look of disgust on her face as she surveyed my property. I had done my research after receiving her letter. Corinne Wellington had moved to Willowbrook Estates just 6 months ago from downtown, where she had worked as a corporate lawyer specializing in real estate development. She had immediately run for HOA president and won by promising to elevate property values and maintain community standards. Her campaign literature featured glossy photos of perfectly manicured lawns and identical mailboxes. The neighbors I had spoken to painted a picture of someone who treated the subdivision like her personal kingdom. She had already issued violations for flower boxes that were the wrong color, mailboxes that were 2 inches too high, and children's toys left visible in front yards. Her weekly property inspections had become the stuff of neighborhood legend. But it was her obsession with that Tesla that really told the story. According to Mrs. Chen from down the road, Corinne washed it twice a week and parked it in the exact center of her driveway for maximum visibility. She had even installed special lighting to illuminate it at night. The car was not just transportation. It was a statement about her status and success. I opened the front door before she could knock, hopping to control the narrative from the start. "Ms. Wellington, I presume," I said, stepping onto the porch. "I received your letter." She looked me up and down with barely concealed disdain, taking in my jeans and work boots. "Mr. Anderson, I am here to conduct an official property inspection as outlined in the HOA bylaws." "This property predates your HOA by 40 years, I replied calmly. "I am not sure you have jurisdiction here." Her smile was sharp as a blade. "Every property in Willowbrook Estates is subject to our covenants. Now, shall we begin?" Without waiting for permission, she strode toward the pasture, her heels sinking into the soft earth with each step. I followed, curious to see how this would play out. Corinne pulled out a measuring tape and began documenting fence heights, taking photos of every structure with her phone. She muttered notes into a digital recorder, her voice growing more agitated with each observation. Unpermitted structures, non-compliant fencing, and this. She paused, pointing at my chicken coop. This is completely unacceptable for a residential neighborhood. That was when Thunder chose to make his appearance. My grandfather's prize bull wandered over to investigate the commotion, his massive frame casting a shadow over Corinne's petite figure. Thunder was a gentle giant, curious about visitors but harmless as a house cat. Corinne screamed. She stumbled backward, her heels catching in the grass as she nearly fell. Her carefully composed facade cracked completely as she stared at 2,000 pounds of black Angus bull with undisguised horror. That thing is a public menace," she gasped, backing toward her car. "It could kill someone." "Thunder is the gentlest animal you will ever meet," I said, reaching out to scratch behind his ears. "He has been on this property for 8 years without a single incident." But Corinne was already retreating, her inspection forgotten in the face of actual livestock. She fumbled with her portfolio, pulling out a thick folder of official-looking documents. "I am hereby serving you with formal notice," she announced, her voice shaking with rage and fear. "You have 30 days to remove all livestock from this property. The barn is to be demolished as a non-conforming structure. Any renovation plans must be submitted to the Architectural Review Committee for approval." She jabbed her finger toward Thunder, who was peacefully chewing grass and completely ignoring her theatrics. "That animal is a liability and a nuisance. If it is not gone within 30 days, I will have it impounded and you will face daily fines of $100. I felt my temper rising, but I kept my voice level. "This is a legal agricultural operation on grandfathered land. You have no authority here." Corinne's laugh was cold and calculating. "We will see about that, Mr. Anderson. The Willowbrook Estates community has standards, and I intend to enforce them. This is not over." She turned on her heel and marched back to her Tesla, leaving deep holes in my lawn from her stilettos. As she drove away, I noticed her license plate, Property 1. Thunder wandered over and nuzzled my shoulder, completely unaware that he had just become the center of a war between two very different visions of what this land should be. The harassment began the very next day. I woke to find another official notice taped to my front door. Daily violation fine, $50 day 1. Corinne had wasted no time in making good on her threat. Every morning brought a new envelope, each one containing another $50 fine for maintaining livestock on residential property. By the end of the first week, I had accumulated $350 in bogus penalties. My lawyer assured me the fines were meaningless without proper jurisdiction, but the psychological warfare was already taking its toll. Corinne's campaign of intimidation went far beyond the daily fines. She began conducting surprise inspections at all hours, arriving unannounced with her clipboard and measuring tape. She photographed every inch of my property from the public road, documenting fence posts, building heights, and even the placement of my garbage cans. The woman had turned harassment into an art form. She recruited neighbors to spy on my activities, offering them reduced HOA fees in exchange for compliance reports. Mrs. Patterson from across the street suddenly found reasons to check her mailbox every time contractors arrived at my property. The Johnsons started walking their dog past my fence 3 times a day, always pausing to take photos. But it was Corinne's attempts to sabotage my renovation that really crossed the line. I discovered her interference when my contractor, Mike, called with unexpected news. "I hate to tell you this," he said, his voice tight with frustration, "but the city is holding up your permits. They say there are questions about zoning compliance and agricultural use restrictions. What kind of questions? I asked, though I already suspected the answer. Someone filed a complaint claiming the renovation violates residential building codes. They want a full environmental impact study and a public hearing before they will approve anything. I knew exactly who that someone was. Corinne had used her connections in the city planning department to tie up my project in red tape. What should have been a routine permit approval had become a bureaucratic nightmare. The situation reached a breaking point 2 weeks later when Corinne showed up with animal control officers. I was at work when my neighbor, old Mrs. Henderson, called with panic in her voice. "They are here," she whispered into the phone. "That awful woman and two men in uniforms. They are trying to take Thunder." I raced home to find Corinne directing the officers around my property like a military commander. She had convinced them that Thunder posed a public safety risk and needed to be impounded immediately. "This animal is a clear and present danger to the community," she declared, pointing dramatically at Thunder, who was peacefully grazing in the far corner of the pasture. "Just yesterday, it charged at me in a threatening manner." The officers looked skeptical but followed protocol, approaching the fence with ropes and tranquilizer equipment. Thunder, sensing the tension, moved away from the strangers but showed no signs of aggression. "Ma'am," one of the officers said to Corinne, "this animal appears calm and contained. Without documented evidence of aggressive behavior, we cannot justify impoundment." Corinne's face flushed red with rage. "I am the HOA president, and I am telling you this animal is dangerous. That should be sufficient authority." "Actually, it is not," I said, arriving just in time to hear her demand. "This is private property with established agricultural rights. These officers have no jurisdiction here without a court order." The confrontation lasted another hour, with Corinne becoming increasingly agitated as the officers explained the legal requirements for livestock impoundment. She finally stormed off, but not before making her most chilling threat yet. "You think you have won something here," she said, her voice dripping with venom. "But I have news for you. This property is worth over $2 million to the right developer. Properly subdivided, it could hold 6 luxury homes. You are sitting on a gold mine, and you are too stupid to realize it." The pieces suddenly fell into place. This was not about HOA rules or community standards. This was about money. Corinne wanted me gone so she could facilitate the sale of my land to developers. The agricultural heritage, the family history, the gentle bull grazing in the pasture, none of it mattered to her except as obstacles to profit. That night, I sat on my grandfather's porch and watched Thunder settle down for the evening. The stars were just beginning to appear, and the sounds of the suburban development faded into the background. For a moment, I could imagine what this land had been like when Grandpa first bought it, when it was surrounded by other farms instead of McMansions. Corinne Wellington thought she could intimidate me into abandoning my family's legacy. She had no idea how wrong she was. This was no longer just about property rights or HOA overreach. This was about preserving something authentic in a world that seemed determined to turn everything into another identical subdivision. The war had begun in earnest, and I was ready to fight. I spent the next 3 days buried in the county records office, digging through decades of property deeds, zoning documents, and legal filings. The musty smell of old paper and the fluorescent lights reminded me of college exam week, but the stakes here were much higher than any grade. What I discovered was even better than I had hoped. The original deed to my grandfather's property, filed in 1983, contained explicit language protecting agricultural use in perpetuity. More importantly, it included water rights and grazing easements that extended beyond the property boundaries, covering areas that were now part of Karen's precious subdivision. The legal language was crystal clear. Said property shall maintain in perpetuity the right to agricultural use including, but not limited to livestock grazing, crop cultivation, and associated farm structures, regardless of surrounding development or zoning changes. But the real bombshell came when I traced the property ownership records. The land that now housed Willowbrook Estates had originally been part of a larger agricultural district. When developers bought the surrounding farms, they were legally required to respect existing agricultural easements. Karen's HOA had been operating under false assumptions about their authority. I photocopied everything and drove straight to my lawyer's office. Sarah Martinez spread the documents across her conference table and whistled low. "This is incredible," she said, studying the easement language. "Not only do you have grandfathered agricultural rights, but you actually have legal claim to grazing access on what is now HOA common land." "What does that mean exactly?" I asked. "It means Karen Wellington has been operating under a fundamental misunderstanding of property law. Your grandfather's cattle have legal right-of-way across portions of the subdivision. The HOA cannot restrict activities that are protected by recorded easements." Armed with this legal ammunition, I began reaching out to neighbors who had seemed sympathetic to my situation. The first person I called was Mrs. Henderson, the elderly woman who had warned me about Karen's animal control visit. Mrs. Henderson lived in a modest ranch house that predated the subdivision by 20 years. She invited me over for coffee and revealed herself to be a treasure trove of local history. "I remember when your grandfather first brought Thunder to the property," she said, pouring coffee from a pot that looked older than I was. "Such a gentle animal. The children in the neighborhood used to love watching him graze." "What was it like before the subdivision?" I asked. Her eyes grew distant. Beautiful farmland as far as you could see. The Millers had cattle to the north, the Johnsons grew corn to the east, and the Peterson family raised horses on the south side. When the developers came through, they promised to preserve the rural character. What a joke that turned out to be. Mrs. Henderson became my first official ally. She agreed to provide written testimony about the historical agricultural use of the area and to attend any legal hearings as a character witness for Thunder's gentle nature. But my investigation into Karen's background revealed something even more damaging. Using public records and social media, I discovered that her husband, Richard Wellington, was a partner in Suburban Development Solutions, a company that specialized in high-density residential projects. The connection was too convenient to be coincidental. I dug deeper and found that Suburban Development Solutions had submitted preliminary proposals to the city for a luxury townhome development on 5 acres of undeveloped land in the Willowbrook Estates area. The legal description matched my property exactly. Karen had not disclosed this obvious conflict of interest when she ran for HOA president. In fact, she had actively concealed it by using her maiden name on all HOA documents, while her husband pursued development opportunities in the same area. I documented everything: the preliminary development proposals, the corporate filings showing Richard's partnership, the property assessments that valued my land at over $2 million for development purposes. Karen was not just an overzealous HOA president. She was a co-conspirator in a scheme to force me off my land for financial gain. My lawyer was ecstatic when I presented the evidence. "This is fraud, potentially criminal fraud," she said, reviewing the documents. "She has used her position as HOA president to harass you into selling property that her husband's company wants to develop. This is a clear violation of fiduciary duty and possibly extortion." We immediately filed counter-complaints with the county and the state attorney general's office. We also petitioned for an emergency hearing to address the bogus fines and harassment campaign. Most importantly, we filed a formal complaint with the HOA board about Corinne's undisclosed conflict of interest. The response was swift and decisive. Within days, I received a call from William Patterson, the HOA board secretary, requesting a meeting to discuss the situation. Two other board members, Janet Morrison and Robert Kim, had been kept in the dark about Corinne's family connections to development interests. "We had no idea about her husband's business," William said during our meeting. "She told us she was simply concerned about property values and community standards. If what you are alleging is true, she has violated her oath of office." I handed over copies of all the evidence. The three board members exchanged glances as they reviewed the development proposals and corporate documents. "We need to call an emergency board meeting," Janet said. "This cannot wait for the regular monthly meeting." "Actually," I said, "I would prefer to address this at the next regular board meeting, in public. I think the entire community deserves to know what their HOA president has been up to." The meeting was scheduled for the following Thursday. Corinne had no idea that her secret was out or that her reign of terror was about to come to a very public end. Thunder wandered over to the fence as I walked back to my house that evening. I scratched behind his ears and smiled. "You have no idea how important you are to this whole thing, big guy. Just keep being your gentle self for a few more days." The Willowbrook Estates Community Center had never seen anything like it. By 7 o'clock on Thursday evening, every chair was filled and people were standing along the walls. Word had spread through the neighborhood that something big was happening at the HOA board meeting. The usual attendance of 12 residents had swelled to over 80. Corinne arrived fashionably late, her heels clicking against the linoleum floor as she made her entrance. She wore a navy blue power suit and carried a leather briefcase that looked expensive enough to feed a small family. Her confidence was absolute as she took her place at the head table, clearly expecting another routine meeting where she could railroad the other board members. "Good evening, everyone," she began, her voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed. "I see we have quite a turnout tonight. Before we begin, I want to address the elephant in the room." She gestured toward me with theatrical disdain. "Mr. Anderson has been spreading malicious rumors about my leadership and making baseless accusations about my motives. Tonight, I intend to set the record straight." Corinne activated a laptop connected to a projector and began her presentation. Professional charts and graphs filled the screen, showing property values throughout the subdivision. Her argument was polished and persuasive, delivered with the skill of someone who had spent years convincing juries. "Agricultural activities in residential neighborhoods decrease property values by an average of 15%, she announced, clicking to a slide showing comparable sales data. "Mr. Anderson's refusal to comply with community standards is literally stealing money from every homeowner in this room." She showed photos of my property taken from the road, focusing on the barn and pasture fencing. "These structures are eyesores that detract from our community's carefully maintained aesthetic. The presence of livestock creates noise, odor, and safety concerns that affect our quality of life." The presentation continued for 20 minutes, building a case that seemed compelling on the surface. Karen knew how to work a room, making eye contact with residents and nodding sympathetically when people murmured agreement. "In conclusion," she said, "I am prepared to offer Mr. Anderson a generous settlement to resolve this matter amicably. The HOA will waive all fines and assist with relocation costs if he agrees to sell his property to a developer who will bring it into compliance with neighborhood standards." The applause was scattered but audible. Several residents nodded approval, clearly swayed by her argument about property values. Board member William Patterson cleared his throat. "Thank you, Karen. Mr. Anderson, you requested time to respond." I stood and walked to the front of the room, my hands shaking slightly as I opened my folder. This was it, the moment where everything would be decided. "Thank you, William. I appreciate the opportunity to address the community about what has really been happening here." I connected my own laptop to the projector, and the first image filled the screen. My grandfather's original property deed from 1983. This is the deed to my family's property, recorded 40 years ago. As you can see, it explicitly protects agricultural use in perpetuity, regardless of surrounding development. I heard murmurs from the crowd as people read the legal language. Karen shifted uncomfortably in her chair, her confident smile beginning to falter. "More importantly," I continued, "this deed includes grazing easements that extend onto what is now HOA common land. My property does not just predate your subdivision. It has legal rights within your subdivision." The murmurs grew louder. Several residents leaned forward in their chairs, suddenly paying closer attention. But the real issue here is not about agricultural rights or property values. It is about corruption and fraud at the highest levels of your HOA leadership. The room fell silent. Karen's face had gone pale, but she maintained her composure. I clicked to the next slide. Corporate documents showing Richard Wellington as a partner in Suburban Development Solutions. Ms. Wellington has failed to disclose that her husband is a partner in a development company that has submitted proposals to build luxury townhomes on my property. She has used her position as HOA president to harass me into selling land that her family stands to profit from developing. Gasps echoed through the room. Karen shot to her feet, her professional facade cracking completely. "That is a lie," she shouted. "I have never discussed your property with my husband's business associates." I clicked to the next slide. The preliminary development proposal with my property's legal description highlighted in yellow. This proposal was submitted to the city 3 months ago, 1 month before you began your harassment campaign against me. The timing is hardly coincidental. The room erupted in angry voices. Residents turned to stare at Karen with expressions ranging from shock to outrage. She stood frozen at the head table, her mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water. Mrs. Henderson stood up in the back of the room, her voice carrying despite her advanced age. "I have lived in this area for 35 years, and I have never seen such disgraceful behavior from an elected official. This woman has lied to all of us." The other board members exchanged glances. William Patterson called for order and then addressed Karen directly. "These are serious allegations, Karen. Do you have any response to the evidence presented?" Karen gathered her composure and launched into a desperate defense. "My husband's business activities are completely separate from my HOA duties. I have always acted in the best interests of this community, and I resent the implication otherwise." But the damage was done. The crowd was hostile now, and several residents were openly calling for her resignation. The board voted 4-1 to suspend Karen pending a full investigation, with only Karen voting against her own suspension. The meeting ended with her storming out, but not before she delivered one final threat. "This is not over, Anderson, not by a long shot." As the crowd dispersed, dozens of residents approached to apologize for not speaking up sooner. Mrs. Henderson patted my arm and smiled. "Your grandfather would be proud, young man. He never backed down from a fight either." I had won the battle, but Karen's parting words echoed in my mind. Something told me the war was far from over. 2 weeks after the board meeting, I thought the worst was over. Karen had been officially removed from her position as HOA president, and the harassment had stopped. My renovation permits were finally approved, and contractors were scheduled to begin work the following Monday. For the first time in months, I allowed myself to believe that peace had returned to my little corner of the world. I should have known better. Friday morning, I was 3 hours into a flight to Chicago for a mandatory work conference when my phone buzzed with a text from Mrs. Henderson. "Emergency at your place. Karen is here with officials. Thunder is upset." My heart sank as I read the message. The plane was already airborne, and I would not be back until late Sunday night. I called Mrs. Henderson immediately. "She came with animal control and code enforcement," Mrs. Henderson whispered, her voice barely audible over the phone. "They have official-looking papers. She told them Thunder attacked her last week." "That is impossible," I said, fighting to keep my voice down in the crowded airplane. "Thunder has never attacked anyone." "I know that and you know that, but these officers do not know Thunder like we do. Karen is putting on quite a performance." I spent the next hour on the phone with my lawyer, trying to coordinate legal intervention from 30,000 feet. Sarah assured me she would contact the appropriate authorities, but the process would take time that Thunder might not have. Meanwhile, Karen's final gambit was unfolding exactly as she had planned. She had waited until I was out of town, knowing that I would be helpless to intervene. She had filed false reports claiming Thunder had aggressively pursued her during a property inspection, creating the legal justification for emergency impoundment. Mrs. Henderson provided a play-by-play via text messages as the situation developed. Karen had arrived in her pristine Tesla, parking it prominently near the pasture gate like a general's command vehicle. She directed the animal control officers with theatrical gestures, pointing at Thunder and describing imaginary aggressive behaviors. The code enforcement officer was there to document safety violations in the fencing, providing additional justification for removing Thunder from the property. Karen had orchestrated the entire operation with military precision, using her legal background to manipulate the system one final time. But Thunder had other plans. According to Mrs. Henderson's frantic text messages, Thunder had been agitated all morning by the strangers invading his peaceful territory. The bull had spent 8 years living quietly on the property, accustomed to familiar faces and routine. The presence of uniformed strangers with ropes and restraining equipment triggered his protective instincts. When the animal control officers approached the fence, Thunder retreated to the far corner of the pasture. He showed no signs of aggression, but Karen was not satisfied with his passive response. "You see how he is glaring at us," she told the officers, her voice rising with manufactured fear. "That is exactly how he looked before he charged at me. This animal is a loaded weapon waiting to go off." The officers remained skeptical. Thunder was clearly calm and contained, showing none of the signs they associated with dangerous animals. But Karen was relentless, demanding they take action based on her fabricated testimony. "The fence is obviously inadequate," she declared, pointing at the sturdy wooden posts that had contained Thunder without incident for years. "It needs to be inspected for safety violations before anyone gets hurt." That was her fatal mistake. The code enforcement officer approached the fence to examine the posts, and Karen followed close behind, still delivering her monologue about public safety. She was so focused on her performance that she failed to notice Thunder's growing agitation. The bull had been watching the strangers for over an hour, his massive head turning to track their movements around his territory. When they approached the fence directly, Thunder's protective instincts finally kicked in. 2,000 pounds of Black Angus bull can generate tremendous force when motivated. The fence that had contained Thunder for years was never designed to withstand a deliberate charge from a protective animal. The wooden posts splintered like matchsticks as Thunder burst through, defending his territory from perceived threats. Karen's scream could be heard 3 blocks away. Thunder's momentum carried him directly toward the gleaming white Tesla parked beside the gate. The bull's massive head struck the driver's side door with the force of a wrecking ball. The impact lifted the rear wheels off the ground and sent the car sliding sideways across the gravel. Thunder was not finished. The bull circled the vehicle and struck again, this time crushing the front bumper and crumpling the hood like aluminum foil. Steam hissed from the broken radiator as Thunder delivered a final blow to the passenger side, caving in the entire roof structure. The animal control officers fled toward their trucks, their equipment forgotten in the face of natural fury. The code enforcement officer was already in his vehicle, reveering rapidly away from the scene. Only Karen remained, standing frozen beside the wreckage of her pride and joy. Thunder snorted once and returned to his pasture, stepping carefully through the gap in the fence he had created. Within minutes, he was grazing peacefully again, as if nothing had happened. Karen's meltdown was legendary. According to Mrs. Henderson's breathless account, she screamed at the officers, threatening lawsuits and demanding they shoot Thunder immediately. When they refused, she called 911 to report a vicious animal attack on her vehicle. The emergency responders arrived to find a calm bull grazing in his pasture, and a hysterical woman standing beside $70,000 worth of German engineering, reduced to expensive scrap metal. By the time I landed in Chicago, the video was already going viral on social media. Someone had recorded Karen's meltdown and Thunder's victorious return to grazing, set to dramatic music. The comments section was flooded with support for Thunder and mockery of Karen's theatrical performance. Thunder had accomplished in 30 seconds what months of legal maneuvering could not. He had ended Karen Wellington's reign of terror with one decisive action. The bull that she had tried to have impounded had delivered the perfect response to her harassment campaign. Sometimes justice comes from the most unexpected sources. The insurance company's decision letter arrived on a Tuesday morning, and I read it 3 times before the words fully sank in. Claim denied due to provoked animal incident and claimant negligence. Karen's attempt to collect $70,000 for her destroyed Tesla had been rejected after a thorough investigation. The insurance adjuster's report was a masterpiece of corporate understatement. The claimant's actions directly contributed to the incident by approaching livestock in an aggressive manner for the stated purpose of having the animal removed from its established territory. The property owner was not present and cannot be held responsible for the animal's defensive response to perceived threats. Mrs. Henderson called that afternoon with the news I had been waiting for. "She is packing," she said, barely able to contain her excitement. Moving trucks arrived this morning. Karen Wellington is finally leaving our neighborhood. I walked over to the fence where Thunder was grazing, his massive frame silhouetted against the afternoon sun. The bull looked up at me with calm, intelligent eyes, completely unaware that he had become a neighborhood legend. I scratched behind his ears and smiled. "You did good, big guy. Grandpa would be proud." The community transformation was remarkable. Karen's departure had created a power vacuum that was quickly filled by reasonable people who actually cared about neighborhood harmony. William Patterson was elected as the new HOA president, and one of his first acts was to formally recognize the agricultural easements on my property. "We want to apologize for the harassment you endured," he said during a special board meeting. "This community was built around existing agricultural properties, and we should have been celebrating that heritage instead of